David Goggins didn't build mental toughness by motivation. He built it by systematically removing every excuse. This video explores the deeper story behind Can't Hurt Me, not as inspiration, but as a framework for self-discipline, suffering, and control. It examines how extreme hardship was turned into structure, and how identity was rebuilt through repetition rather than belief. By the end, it becomes clear why this approach works when motivation fails, and why it demands a cost most people never consider. Before strength, before endurance, before discipline, there was collapse. David Goggins' early life was defined by stability rather than direction. Violence, insecurity, and constant pressure shaped an environment where survival mattered more than progress. There was no long-term plan, only reaction, only endurance. Weight gain, academic struggle, and low expectations followed. The body deteriorated, confidence eroded, identity narrowed. By adulthood, momentum had stalled completely. There was no external pressure to change, no intervention, no rescue. This period mattered because it removed illusion. There was no belief in hidden potential, no sense of destiny, just evidence of decline. What followed wasn't inspiration, it was confrontation. A realization that comfort had become destructive, that avoidance had turned into identity. The foundation of Can't Hurt Me was not built on optimism. It was built on dissatisfaction so intense it eliminated denial. Change didn't begin with belief. It began with refusal, and refusal demanded something harsher than motivation. The shift didn't come from gradual improvement or careful adjustment. It came from total disruption. The body was forced into compliance, weight was dropped aggressively, sleep was sacrificed, routine replaced emotion as the primary driver of behavior. Comfort was removed deliberately. There was no negotiation. Discipline was treated as non-optional. Failure was not analyzed emotionally or justified mentally. It was corrected mechanically. The response of falling short was action, not reflection. This period introduced a central principle that defined everything that followed. Identify follows behavior, not intention. Instead of waiting to feel ready, capable, or confident, action was taken first, repeatedly, brutally. Readiness became a result rather than a requirement. Physical suffering became a training ground for control. The body learned compliance, but the mind learned something more important. Discomfort didn't require retreat. Pain was not a signal stop. It became informational rather than prohibitive. This wasn't self-improvement. It was self-replacement. The previous identity was not healed or reframed. It was overridden through repetition. Each completed task weakened dependence on motivation. Structure replaced feeling as the governing force. Momentum returned not because circumstances improved, but because rules were enforced regardless of circumstance. Execution no longer depended on conditions. It depended on adherence. But discipline alone was not enough to sustain pressure. As physical capacity expanded, the system scaled with it. Challenges were increased deliberately, not impulsively. Endurance events, extreme training, and prolonged stress were introduced, not for achievement or recognition, but for exposure. The objective was not to win. It was to experience pressure repeatedly until it lost its ability to disrupt execution. Suffering became predictable, planned, measured. It was no longer treated as an emergency. It became part of the process. This phase was never about proving strength publicly. It was about removing fear privately. Repeated exposure to limits rewired response patterns. Panic diminished. Resistance shortened. The body learned endurance, but the mind learned control. A system began to emerge. Discomfort became training. Repetition became validation. Accountability became structure. Progress was logged rather than celebrated. Weaknesses were documented instead of hidden. The mind was treated like an opponent to be studied, not a voice to obey. This framework turned chaos into control. Stress no longer signaled danger or failure. It signaled procedure. Pressure became familiar rather than threatening. Over time, the scale increased. What once felt impossible became routine, not because pain disappeared, but because reaction changed. Response replaced resistance. But systems attract resistance. As visibility grew, scrutiny followed. The methods were labeled extreme, unhealthy, and unsustainable. Critics focused on physical damage rather than discipline, questioning the long-term viability of such an approach. The narrative shifted from resilience to risk. The body eventually responded. Injuries accumulated. Fatigue intensified. Systems cracked under prolonged load. These outcomes weren't unexpected. They were the natural result of sustained pressure applied without relief. This was not ignored. It was integrated. Breakdowns were not treated as failure or contradiction. They were treated as data. Limits were not denied or dismissed. They were identified, measured, and mapped. The body became another system to analyze, rather than an obstacle to overcome. The core philosophy did not change. What changed was execution. Adaptation replaced escalation. Recovery became structured, rather than incidental. Training evolved to preserve capability rather than prove toughness. Criticism revealed something essential. The method was never designed for comfort. It was designed for control. It did not promise balance or wellness. It promised capacity under pressure. This phase clarified the cost. Discipline without awareness becomes destruction. Endurance without adjustment collapses. Systems that survive must adapt without surrendering their foundation. The method endured because it evolved while remaining intact, and that adaptability became the real advantage. Over time, motivation disappeared entirely from the equation. Action no longer depended on emotional state. Discipline functioned independently, operating whether conditions felt favorable or not. This separation marked a critical shift. Progress was no longer tied to inspiration, energy, or confidence. This is where most systems fail. When results slow, when attention fades, when effort stops producing visible reward, motivation erodes, and behavior follows. Momentum collapses not because the goal is unreachable, but because the system depends on feeling encouraged. Here, repetition carried momentum instead. Identity was no longer questioned or renegotiated. Tasks were executed regardless of emotional response. Consistency replaced intensity as the primary measure of progress. Endurance became psychological rather than physical. The challenge was no longer tolerating pain, but maintaining execution without reinforcement. The work continued, even when it felt routine, unrewarding, or invisible. This is where Can't Hurt Me departs from inspiration entirely. It doesn't offer relief, affirmation, or emotional release. It offers responsibility. Behavior is treated as obligation, not expression. The system endured because it did not rely on peaks. It relied on process. There was no finish line to reach, only maintenance to uphold. This phase explains longevity. When motivation collapses, systems survive. When identity is defined by behavior, pressure loses leverage, which reveals the truth most people miss. The untold truth is not resilience, it's control. Can't Hurt Me isn't built around the idea of becoming invincible or immune to difficulty. It's built around becoming predictable under stress. Pain doesn't disappear. Fear does not vanish. What changes is response. Reaction is delayed, measured, and stripped of urgency. The system works because it removes negotiation. There is no debate with discomfort, no internal bargaining. Suffering became procedural rather than emotional. It's expected, scheduled, and processed. Emotion is acknowledged but no longer allowed to dictate behavior. This reframes the entire philosophy. It's not self-belief or positive thinking. It's self-governance. Not motivation, but enforcement. Action is taken regardless of mood, confidence, or desire. Structure replaces impulse. The method does not promise happiness, balance, or comfort. It promises reliability. Under pressure, behavior remains consistent. When conditions worsen, execution continues. Most systems fail because they depend on feeling prepared, inspired, or aligned. When those feelings disappear, progress collapses. This system survives because it ignores them. It operates independently of emotion. That is the cost, the constant demand, the absence of relief. And that is also the advantage. This story is not about inspiration, it's about structure. It's how discipline replaced identity, how suffering was converted into usable data, and how repetition outlasted motivation. Progress did not depend on belief or emotion, but on systems enforced consistently, even when momentum slowed and comfort disappeared. And that is why it works.